Hello everybody and welcome to the UFC 298 edition of the Sideswipe MMA betting podcast. I am on a pretty tight schedule this week, so I am going to fly through proceedings of recapping UFC Vegas 86 before we get into the breakdowns themselves. I won 1.43 units on the event with a return on investment of 10.59%. Honestly, I expected a little bit more from UFC Vegas 86. I had max bets on Daniel Marcos and Devin Clark. The Devin Clark bet was an atrocious one. I will hold my hands up there. Once the leg kicks got going, it was too late, and I really did not give Prachniyar's kicking game the respect it probably deserved. The Daniel Marcos result was a frustrating one. I personally think Arichi Lang looked for a way out there. I don't blame him. If I had a bet on Arichi Lang, that's what I would have wanted him to do. Just a really unfortunate turn of events because I think Daniel Marcos was massive value at minus 188. Elsewhere, an underdog win on Max Griffin and some shrewd betting on the Haider-Amil fight, betting on him to win in rounds 2 or 3 and betting him to win inside the distance and also for the fight not to go the distance. But overall, I do genuinely think it could have been a lot more, but, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, as they say. Onwards to UFC 298. UFC 298 is pretty much a tale of two halves because the first few fights really pale in comparison to the latter half and the main card of the event. It's a shame for a UK guy like myself who doesn't really have the stamina to stay up for a pay-per-view as they go to about 5 or 6 a.m. But at least it will crescendo into something pretty amazing for everybody else. Before we get into the breakdowns, it is important for me to just remind everybody that I break these fights down from a betting perspective. With that in mind, there are going to be lots of times where there are some sort of variables involved in fights that make them almost impossible to get a strong read on, regardless of how much footage and how familiar we are with the fighters in question. I've had some people recently ask me who I think personally is going to win the fight and asking why I don't give picks at the end of my breakdowns, but essentially I don't really think that that matters at all, and it's not going to help you with your bets because betting isn't about picking winners, it's about identifying value with the numbers in front of you. So I focus on the numbers and not the names. It's something that I'm always saying on Reddit. I just thought it was important to address that topic before we get started because you'll see why in a bit. There are a few red flags of some of these main card fighters, which unfortunately makes it a little bit more of a minefield to go through from a betting perspective. But without further ado, let's just get into it. And of course, our main event of the evening is a featherweight title fight between Alexander Volkanovski and Elliott Topuria. This is a fight that I am very, very excited for, as are you, as is everyone else in the MMA community. Elliott Topuria has been one of the public's prospects for years now, and he actually managed to make it all the way to challenge one of the most dominant and complete champions the UFC's ever seen. Unfortunately, though, this fight really is happening at the worst time for Volkanovski and for us as bettors. He obviously is coming off that first round head kick loss at the hands of Islam Makhachev. No hate to him at all for that loss. He's obviously still a legend, and the fact that he stepped up and took that fight was impressive to say the least. I did kind of rant about how I was disappointed that he was tarnishing his legacy, but that result does really bring some serious questions into play about where Volkanovski is going to be physically and mentally. Many fighters never come back the same after a KO loss, especially their first one in 10 years, which is what that is for Volkanovski. There's also the morale conversation, so thinking mentally. Volkanovski only really had one thing left to achieve in his already Hall of Fame-worthy career, and that was to become a double champ. He could defend the featherweight title until the cows come home, but until he has 2 belts to his name, I don't think he would be satisfied given how elite a fighter he is. The loss to Makhachev kind of just killed that dream dead in the water, so I don't think it's crazy to assume that perhaps Volkanovski isn't as motivated as he usually is. It's pure speculation and you can't hang your hat on an idea like that, but honestly, I think it's enough of a question to be asking. To make matters worse, Volkanovski is also now 35 years old, which makes him a prime candidate to be the next victim of the well-known over 35s curse. For those of you who don't know, over 35-year-olds across all weight classes from welterweight downwards have a record of 2 wins and 31 losses in title fights, which is pretty shocking. If you were wondering, Tyron Woodley with 2 wins is the only guy to actually rack up a win of that 33 fight sample size. Intangibles aside, if Volkanovski was coming into this fight having just won the trilogy bout against Holloway, I would still be telling you that this one's going to be relatively close because I do think both guys are really, really high-level fighters. Of course, in that instance, and also in this instance, I do favour the champion because he has that 5-round experience and he has the high-stakes experience. He knows how to get out of those tricky spots, how to fight when the going gets tough, the pressure, the crowd, the fight week preparations and all of the stuff that goes into the show. But all of these things only really add up to so much of a margin. I do still still think this one should be close. On the flip side of that, when you factor in all of the doubts that I've already mentioned about Volkanovski, I do think that the betting line ends up looking very similar to where it is, which is pretty much a pick'em. It's a bit of a boring stance to take, but as I said in the intro, it's kind of hard to look at a fight objectively when there are some absolutely glaringly obvious red flags that you'd be silly to ignore. Featherweight's a bit of a tricky division at the best of times because everyone involved is a well-rounded fighter that wants to strike for 25 minutes, so I feel like that division sees me splitting hairs between guys a lot of the time, and this fight is absolutely no different. There's no value on the betting line for me. I think it's an easy pass. Despite how high level the fight is, it's kind of a shame to sort of turn your nose up at a fight like this from a betting perspective, but I think you have to. It should probably be around a pick'em for me, maybe with a slight lean towards Volkanovski because he is the champion. Despite not having a real interest in this fight from a moneyline perspective, I was really keen to see how the books were going to line the overs and the fight goes the distance props. Thankfully, some of the books have released this a little bit early, just before fight week, so I've managed to jump on the over 2.5 rounds at -160 for 2 units. Both guys are historically durable, and neither of them are monstrous hitters. We did see Topuria score a few KOs on his way up the rankings, but the guys that he flatlined are pretty much prime suspects for that kind of thing. They can't be compared to Volkanovski in terms of defense or durability. I bet Topuria versus Emmett to go the distance in that main event last year, and I think it was at like plus 250 or something, and it was one of my best prop wins of 2023, so I'm happy to lean on that narrative again. I think the market massively overrates Topuria as a finisher, and Volkanovski has been very durable aside from getting head kicked, which I don't really think you can judge a fighter's durability based off a high impact shot like that. So I'm still happy to trust that Volkanovski is going to be able to weather the early storm and that this one sets into a more sort of tepid and technical pace like Volkanovski's title fights very often do. So for 2 units, I'll be rooting for this one to go over the halfway mark at -160. And next up in the co-main event, we have a showdown between Robert Whittaker and Paulo Costa, which is obviously going to be an exciting one for the fans. It really is shit that this is the second blockbuster fight, the co-main event of a massive pay-per-view card, but unfortunately I have to take the same stance as I did with the main event. Robert Whittaker looked so bad in that Dricus du Plessis loss, didn't he? Just like I'm wary of fighters who are coming in off a KO loss, I'm also wary of fighters that are making their return after a shockingly underwhelming performance, especially in instances like with Robert Whittaker, where he's been in a number of famous wars, he's been beaten up, he's been busted up, he's had to come through a lot of adversity, and he's had a lengthy career. So if that fight against du Plessis was the start of a pretty sharp decline for the Aussie, I would not be surprised. I do think that how bad Robert Whittaker looked is definitely reflected in this line though, because had we never seen that Dricus du Plessis fight, there's no way Robert Whittaker would be around -200 to Paulo Costa. That discount does make this betting line sound about right to me, and I'm sure it will entice some people, because at the end of the day, if Whittaker just had an off night or had some sort of internal thing going on and is as good as he's always been, then -190, -200 against Paulo Costa is some insanely good value. So if you want to roll the dice on it and you don't really care if you lose, that's perfectly fine, but there's a glaringly obvious warning sign that Robert Whittaker may not be the guy that we think he is, and that is enough of a warning sign for me to stay away. So I didn't really look at this fight from a technical perspective. I didn't really break it down in any huge detail. I just rewatched Whittaker's loss to du Plessis and thought, yeah, I can't trust that guy. I don't know who he is anymore. So it's no bet for me. I'm sorry that is the second kind of boring breakdown in a row, but I promise I do have some stronger takes as we go further on down the card. And next up we have Jeff Neal versus Ian Machado Garry. I'm really glad that we are getting this fight after it was scheduled a year or so ago but fell through. Ian Garry really gets on my nerves because I just think he's a massive hypocrite. His entire popularity is based on him being provocative to his opponents and getting clickbait headlines for absolutely no reason. Like when he used Jeff Neal's mugshot to sell t-shirts in the build-up to that fight, despite the fact that they were totally cool beforehand. That's why I found it pretty funny when the MMA world got a hold of the story with his wife and her strange philosophies on life, because Ian Garry cried and called foul play. It's similar reasons why I was critical of Sean Strickland a couple of weeks ago, because if you can't take it, don't dish it out. And these guys are two of the most loudmouth MMA fighters we have on the roster at the moment, but both of them are crying like babies when things don't go their way. Having said all that, I do appreciate that Ian Garry has grown into a really promising striker. His UFC career has had its flaws, namely in his very underwhelming debut where he struggled for most of it, and also when he got dropped by Song Kenan a few fights ago. But people do really love to hate the guy, so they focus way too much on those moments instead of giving him credit for the good stuff that he does, because there's a lot of good out there in his tape. I think he's deserving of the spot that he's in, and I think he could make it all the way to the top 5, especially if he has a pretty commanding win here. Jeff Neal, on the other hand, is a fighter that I've never really understood. He's good at what he does, he's hard-nosed, he's dedicated to landing those heavy shots, and he's a capable finisher that will walk forward and try and put your lights out. But I just do not rate his minute-winning ability against a fellow capable striker, and you cannot just get to the very top of the division with nothing but power. People give him credit for the way that he fought against Shavkat, but it just, to me, confirmed that that flaw is a flaw in his style. It just doesn't look pretty if he's not putting his opponents to sleep. Another fight where that conclusion came true was against Wonderboy Thompson, where he quite frankly got embarrassed and given a vet lesson against Thompson, who was kind of on the decline at the time, or so we thought. The Wonderboy comparison is actually pretty massive here, as I think Ian Garry has a kind of similar-ish style when it comes to footwork and evasiveness and distance management, and a conservative approach from the Irishman should see him justify the price tag here with relative ease, I think. For context, he's around minus 200. If Garry stays safe and pot shots his way to a decision, I'm confident that he does enough and clearly outlands Neal, and I don't see him really exerting himself and really trying to find the finish when that obviously puts him in danger. If he just cruises and puts in a pretty tepid display, that's the easiest path to victory for him. The fans won't like it because they like one guy and they hate the other, but I do think this is a very favourable matchup for Garry. The fans are going to boo because he's going to be out the way of all of Neal's heavy shots, but that's the way he needs to win. So I'm therefore interested in seeing what kind of price I can get on Ian Garry to win by decision. He's not the hardest hitter anyway, he doesn't grapple very often, and Neal is definitely tough. So I think a win probably should come for Garry via the scorecards. If I could get something like plus 150 for a prop like that, I'd be very interested in taking it for a unit or two. But in terms of the money line, I think there's a little tiny bit of value on Ian Garry, but not enough to warrant a bet. I would have Garry at around minus 225 myself, which obviously isn't far off of the minus 200 that I'm currently seeing, so it's no bet for me, but that prop does definitely interest me. Elsewhere on the main card, we have Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo. It's mad that a fight this high caliber is third from the top of the billing. The fact that this one is not a main event is honestly insane, and the fact that this card isn't the UFC 300 card that they promised us. We really are being treated by the UFC in the next few months. Credit to them. So Merab Dvalishvili's ascent up the division is unfortunately taking far longer than it really should have. It's really annoying to me that he's had to wait so long for a title shot that he hasn't even received yet. But I suppose Aljamain Sterling being on the throne for most of Merab's UFC career has kind of stopped that from happening. Would have been nice to see those two fight, but I kind of respect the fact that they never got round to it because they're friends. I talk quite often about how my favourite type of fighters are ones who can weaponize cardio, and I think that Merab may actually be the godfather of that kind of a style. He's definitely the best UFC example of that kind of style. He's not actually that good of a striker or a grappler. Like, if you watch exchange by exchange, all of his moments in a fight spliced together, he's not super technical or super elite. And if you watch all of his top control moments spliced together, he's not particularly good at maintaining the position that he wins. But the difference is that he can fight with the same output, intensity and sharpness in minute 1 as he can in minute 25, which opponents simply cannot do. So he basically just keeps his B-level technique consistent throughout the fight, whereas a lot of fighters who may actually be better at him at one discipline fall off as the fight goes on. Obviously, we haven't seen Henry Cejudo fight a whole lot in the last few years. That comeback fight against Aljamain Sterling was pretty much the only real sample size we can look into in terms of analysing how he's going to look in this fight. So that fight was obviously a very important part of the tape here. In that fight, Sterling had great success against Cejudo using both his reach and his high volume to completely overwhelm Triple C on the feet. So that idea of high volume is obviously something that Merab is going to be able to weaponize. Both men landed decent shots in that fight, but Aljo's commitment to forward pressure was definitely the difference in terms of establishing him as the better striker. And that's obviously something that Merab's going to be able to do. It's exactly what he did against Peter Yan, who, again, you would have thought would be a better striker than Merab. However, Cejudo showed his obvious wrestling credentials in that fight, defending pretty much every single or double leg that Sterling attempted. That comes as no surprise, really, because, to be a high-level wrestler, you have to be as good defensively as you are offensively. But it does bring up serious questions regarding this fight, because regardless of how much we can compliment Merab's precious fighting on the feet, he is a wrestler at heart, and that's what he does best. To me, that's what it ultimately comes down to here, I'm afraid. Both men have got to where they are in their careers because of their abilities to wrestle. And once you remove that from their arsenal, because they probably cancel each other out here, you're talking about a reduced caliber of fighter and fighters who are being forced to fight where they're not the most comfortable. Merab is still great at what he does with that pressure style. He was even good enough to beat Peter Yan, as I said. So I obviously do side with him on the betting line, but it's just not the same level of confidence as it would be if Merab was fighting somebody who wasn't as good a defensive wrestler as Cejudo is. One narrative I am really intrigued by in this fight is looking at Cejudo's motivations for actually taking it in the first place. Yes, he's still in the title picture, and yes, he does have a little bit of a beef with Merab, but having already hit his peak with that double champ status, retiring and then coming back and losing that title fight, I just don't really understand why Henry's still in the game. It's kind of a similar sort of challenge that I put with Volkanovski, because Volkanovski is chasing something that Cejudo already has. Cejudo wanted out of the game after he got that double champion status. He was happily out, and then he tarnished his legacy by coming back and losing to Aljamain Sterling. So why come back and tarnish it again by losing to an even scarier fighter in Merab? Even if Cejudo does win here, he's probably still never going to get a title shot again because he's old, he can't be trusted to reign over a division, and he's also old news. There are so many other killers at bantamweight that the UFC would rather have in the title picture. So what's in it for Triple C in this fight? Either way, I think the books have once again got the price just right here. I think that Merab should have moderate favoritism at the betting window. Anything up to about minus 200 sounds about right to me, which is coincidentally exactly where it is. So I don't think there's any value, and I don't think that there's a bet. Similar to what I said about Volkanovski versus Topuria, though, I'll be keeping a keen eye on the overs or the fight goes the distance. I'm sure the price will be rubbish because both men are historically not finishers. Both men have got great cardio, both men are durable. That does seem like a pretty safe prop choice, so I'm interested to see what price it is as to whether or not I use it in any parlays. We'll see. Next up, it's a prospect showdown between Anthony Fluffy Hernandez and Roman Kopylov. This, I think, is one of the most sensational pieces of matchmaking on the card, and funnily enough, it was a short notice replacement with Kopylov coming in late. These are exactly the kind of bouts that I want to see the UFC putting on. It doesn't always have to be blockbuster AAA names on the top of cards, but instead it's legitimate dudes that have deserved the opportunity to grab that brass ring and turn themselves into a household name or a prospect or a top 10 fighter. This one's also really fun because it's two guys who are in amazing form but also have styles that completely juxtapose each other. This one is definitely striker versus grappler. Fluffy Hernandez is your grappler, and he's got one hell of a suffocating style. He sticks to you like glue, and he fights at such a pace that honestly it is exhausting to watch. It must suck being his opponent. It's something I think every single time I see him fight. On the other hand, we have Roman Kopylov, who is obviously the striker. His start to the UFC was very underwhelming, but I've been so impressed with how he's turned the corner inside the cage. I remember our introduction to him was him getting out-grappled by Carl Robertson, and I think that is genuinely one of the most embarrassing things that a UFC fighter has ever suffered. So the fact that we've managed to change our opinion and actually look at Kopylov as someone who has potential to make it to the top 15, it's quite insane. This fight feels like a real pick your poison spot for a bettor because despite how impressive both guys have looked in their recent fights and doing the thing that they do best, they've both suffered losses in their UFC careers, and we have seen them fall victim to the exact style that their opponent brings to the table here. Albert Duraev managed to outgrapple Roman Kopylov and brutalize him in a way that I could see Fluffy Hernandez doing. That was just a grappling-based beatdown. Conversely, Kevin Holland exposed the weak body of Fluffy Hernandez, and it's not the first time we've seen him hit to the body. He definitely has a weakness there. And Kopylov is one of the more dedicated body attackers in the UFC today, so both men have a very clear path to victory that they should be able to realize and bring into action. It just depends on which guy gets there first. However, the big caveat in this fight is that Kopylov is coming in on short notice, stepping up to fight a Hernandez that has been preparing for the toughest fight of his career and the biggest opportunity on a main card spot. Given that Hernandez is one of those cardio freaks, I think that this is a pretty dangerous sign for Kopylov because you don't really want to be facing someone like Hernandez at the best of times, but considering your cardio isn't going to be as sharp as it should be, that's pretty dangerous. Also, Fluffy's suffocating style is going to crowd Roman and not give him the opportunity to be the sniper that he wants to be with those clinical straight shots. And the takedown threat that Hernandez is obviously going to be posing is going to probably reduce that output anyway. So there's a high chance that you see Kopylov not looking his best and not putting on the striking clinic that we've seen him have in recent fights. Also, there's also a chance that Kopylov's grappling is actually not particularly great and that we just haven't seen it exposed that much. When you consider that Albert Duraev is the guy that has mauled him and actually handed him a loss in the UFC, and we consider how we feel about Duraev now, seeing that he's lost multiple fights and definitely looks like he's on his way out of the company. Actually, I think he did get cut a couple of weeks ago, when his fight fell through. Comparing him to Fluffy Hernandez, really, there are levels to that. So you would assume that if Duraev is able to have those successes, then Fluffy can realize them too. For me, all of that leans towards Hernandez probably being about minus 200 on the betting line here. Given that I can see him at minus 163, I therefore think there's a little bit of value there. So I played Fluffy Hernandez for 2 units at minus 163. And the following fight is a women's MMA showdown between Amanda Lemos and Mackenzie Dern. Those of you who've ever heard or read any of my stuff before, you'll know that I'm a big women's MMA advocate, and I'm always talking about how I think it's easier to bet on and analyze than men's MMA. But Mackenzie Dern is an exception to that, as I think she's the hardest fighter to get a read on from a betting perspective. She's pretty basic in terms of her skill set. She's obviously a very high-level grappler, and she's got subpar striking that sometimes is overinflated due to a little bit of power. But she has absolutely no wrestling whatsoever and seems to have fallen in love with her striking in recent years. I wrote a big old breakdown for Mackenzie Dern's fight against Jessica Andrade, where I said she wasn't trustworthy as a favourite because she fails to lean on the most obvious path to victory that stares her right in the face, and instead she manages to find herself in her opponent's wheelhouse, and that's exactly what she did when she got finished by Jessica Andrade. Amanda Lemos is pretty much a regen version of Jessica Andrade with a bit less tenacity and a bit more size. Her striking is equally as effective and dominant compared to most women in terms of volume, power, and just general dangerousness, but her wrestling and bottom grappling remain a weakness that opponents can exploit should they choose to. This was very evident in her most recent loss to Weili Zhang, where she got dominated by a career-long striker. 16 minutes of top control and 6 takedowns, which is a pretty criminal amount to concede at a championship level. You can see where I'm going with this. This is what I like to call an I told you so fight, where both fighters have the potential to win in a dominant fashion, but the chances of either one being the one to get their hands raised is almost equally likely. That therefore means that the betting line has to look like a pick'em. Despite that, there will be some idiots who will be shouting from the rooftop when they win a bet on this fight, saying, I told you so, look how much value I got, as they completely ignore all of the genuine concerns that their opponent brought to the table and that everyone else was taking seriously. Don't be like those guys. I think this one should be lined closely because Lemos' domination on the feet is exactly the same as Dern's domination on the mat. I'd lean Lemos' way simply because all fights start standing, and Dern has a proven track record of not realizing that easy path to victory and not shooting the takedowns, or even if she does, not having success with them because her wrestling isn't good enough. I don't necessarily want to hang my hat on that, but I do think that Amanda Lemos could actually probably look like more value at like minus 135 where she currently is. I think she should probably be about minus 150 to minus 160, so it's not enough for me to put a bet on it, but Amanda Lemos is probably the side of the two of them. But really, I don't think anyone should be keen to bet on this fight because we've seen this exact type of fight for Mackenzie Dern so many times in the last few years, and she's dropped the ball more often than she hasn't. Off the top of my head, I can think of Yan Xiaonan, Jessica Andrade, Marina Rodriguez. She was supposed to have an easy path to victory via grappling dominance and a submission, and she failed on all 3 accounts. Moving on to our next fight, we have a heavyweight showdown between Marcus Rogerio de Lima and Justin Tafa. Do you ever get those fighters that, against your better judgment, you just can't help but feel like they're super talented and that they always deserve another chance when they fuck it up? Because Marcus Rogerio de Lima is that guy for me. I always seem to want to bet on him. I had 3 units on him at plus 100 in the Derek Lewis fight most recently, and I think he closed at like minus 200 or something, which shows that the public were pretty much on my side with my analysis of the fight before it took place. The heavyweight circus was on full show in that night, with Derek Lewis channeling his inner Jorge Masvidal and throwing a flying knee right out the gate. But I promise you, I would still put 3 units on de Lima at plus 100 right now if he was fighting Derek Lewis this weekend instead. I still think that bet was great. Unfortunately, we just got a very high variance version of that fight with Derek Lewis fighting with such crazy urgency, which is something we don't often see from him. Fair play to Derek, but it was disappointing that we didn't get the version I thought we were going to get of that fight. Before that fight, I bet de Lima to beat Waldo Cortez Acosta, who is a fat heavyweight with hands and nothing else. I told everyone not to bet Waldo Cortez Acosta to finish Andrei Arlovski because he just couldn't be trusted to do that. But in that fight, we saw de Lima exercise all of the reasons that I think he actually is a top 10 heavyweight. He didn't shy away from the striking, he expertly disarmed his opponent with calf kicks, and he also mixed in a very competent wrestling game. De Lima's diverse offense and ability to lean on skills that aren't typical for a heavyweight make him a pretty tricky test for anyone, especially in a division where where a lot of the fighters have skill sets like it's 2001 and MMA is a niche sport. And guess who De Lima is fighting here? Another fat heavyweight that just wants to throw hands, Justin Tafa. Tafa is probably even more limited than Waldo Cortez Acosta was. He's a round one finisher or Jesus take the wheel. It really is a testament to how awful heavyweight MMA is at a UFC level, because not a single person has really tested Tafa's ground game yet. Anyone who's watched his pre-UFC regional footage would know how awful he is when it comes to grappling, and he is the definition of a fish out of water on the mat. It was on the Australasian regional scene as well. Honestly, some of the funniest regional tape I've ever seen. It's been 5 years since I watched it, and I still remember it clear as day. So yeah, back to this fight. I think that there's so much recency bias on the betting line here between De Lima and Justin Tafa. If De Lima can do what he did to Waldo Cortez Acosta, he should find it even easier to do it to Justin Tafa, who likely has much worse grappling and cardio than Waldo does. I know there's obviously a chance that Tafa's made improvements to his takedown defense and his grappling since I saw him pre-UFC, but considering he's just like the regen of Mark Hunt, do you really think he drills BJJ that much, especially at the camp that he's at? Do you really think they've got a whole lot of heavyweight killers who are going to wrestle and grapple him on the mat? I'd be surprised if that was the case. On the feet, this is a close fight. It could go either way, especially with the power that Tafa definitely has. But on the mat, I think it's absolutely one-way traffic. I hate betting heavyweight MMA because one wrong move could be so costly, and I saw that in the Derek Lewis versus De Lima fight. But I think there's serious value on De Lima here, like there always is in every single fight and every time his fights get lined. So having said all that, I have come back a couple of days later to record some more thoughts. Whilst everything that I'd previously said and that you've previously heard was leaning towards me betting on De Lima, and I actually did a couple of days ago, I've since changed my mind and cashed out of that. I do still think there is value on him to win this fight, and if you're somebody who wants to bet on every single fight on the card as an enjoyment perspective, I definitely recommend being on the Lima side as opposed to the Tafa side. But I've reminded myself that he is coming off of a potential career-altering stoppage at the hands of Derek Lewis, one that did a lot of damage to him. He was talking about how he was like eating through a straw for a few weeks. When a fighter takes that kind of damage, you do have to be careful as to whether or not they are going to come back as the version that you're familiar with. And so much of my breakdown of this fight is me talking about De Lima and the positives that he's brought to the table so far and referencing previous fights. We may just not get that same version. So I'm going to pass on this fight. I do still think that if he chooses to grapple and he has the high IQ, he will be able to just steamroll Tafa. But it's no bet from me. I just can't risk it on a guy who's got the potential to look anything like a massively regressed version or the same version of that fighter. So it is a pass from me, despite seeing a little bit of value on De Lima at this price. Next up, it's the return of the undefeated Japanese prospect as Rinya Nakamura faces Carlos Vera. Rinya Nakamura does look like a really interesting prospect, in my opinion. Obviously, he's got a strong wrestling background, which is a nightmare base to have for MMA, but he's also got some really explosive striking and power that he started putting to good use. When you transition from being a one-dimensional wrestler to actually being able to competently throw hands, that's when you level up. As long as he doesn't fall in love with his striking and forget what got him to the dance, he should be fine, and I do genuinely think he could have a bright future in the UFC. Obviously, I know next to nothing about Carlos Vera, so I went back and watched his one and only fight with the organization, which was a loss to Brad Katona in an exhibition on The Ultimate Fighter. It told me everything I need to know about this fight, I think. He doesn't have good footwork, and he allows himself to get pushed against the fence, and once he's against the fence, his takedown defense didn't cut it. Didn't cut it against Brad Katona, it isn't going to cut it against Rinya Nakamura. And when he was on the mat, I found him to be too patient. He waited for the perfect opportunity to initiate a scramble and try to catch his opponent on the transition, and that's when he made his move. And whilst that did work for him on 2 different occasions against Katona, he'd already lost the round by the time the opportunity presented itself, letting Katona have about 3 minutes of control time just so he could stand up. So in summary, Nakamura probably does what he wants here, and he's minus 700 on the betting line, which kind of demonstrates that. I'm personally of the belief that there's no such thing as value on a minus 700 on a money line in MMA. I therefore don't think you should be putting him in parlays because the juice definitely isn't worth the squeeze. If you're not sure about that, do yourself a favor, build your parlay and don't put Nakamura in it, see what the payout is, then put Nakamura in it and see what the payout is. The difference between having him in and not having him in is not worth risking it. You're literally betting on half-naked men fighting in a cage. Anything could happen. It could simply be a case of Nakamura getting caught cold by Vera and Vera actually knocking him out, but it doesn't even have to be about his opponent. Say, for example, Rinya rolls his ankle in the warm-up a couple of days ago, but he doesn't want to pull out of the fight because he wants to get paid? What if he eats some dodgy food the day after the weigh-ins? I know the chances of these things are low, but when we're looking at probability, you do have to factor in some random intangibles. And when you're looking at needing him to win at a confidence of about 90%, just for there to be value on this 85% minus 700, you're not going to be able to find it. Sorry about the little rant, I've gone a bit off topic there, but just don't put Nakamura in your parlays. And in the next fight, we have Val Woodburn versus Elliott. You've probably realised that the quality of the analysis is definitely taking a bit of a dip here, because I did say at the start of the show that this is a card where the top half is very different to the bottom half. We're looking at debutantes, we're looking at people with very little UFC experience, and it's a lot harder to have a strong opinion, so most of the time I just skim over them all. I was actually going to completely skip this fight, but I do feel obligated to talk a little bit about Elliott. So one of my rules for MMA betting that I've always stuck by and has always served me very well: beware of a fighter whose number one attribute is their toughness. Toughness has its moments of being useful inside the cage, and obviously there are times where biting down on the mouthpiece can be the difference between winning and losing. But most of the time, being called tough is actually a compliment used to describe fighters who get beaten up and lose minutes more often than they win them. Some of the toughest fighters I can think of off the top of my head are people like Kyle Bochniak, Chris Martinho, or Thomas Gifford. Guys who got absolutely beat the fuck up in most of their UFC career, but people remember them for being tough. Elliott is only in the UFC so far because he showed toughness on Dana White's Contender Series. That fight was a bit of a barn burner, and I was impressed at how he stuck in there, but it was a testament to toughness being a positive skill. It got him the win, but it also told us that he struggled against a guy who isn't UFC caliber yet. So what happens when he actually fights a guy who's UFC caliber? Elliott does not deserve to be minus 250 in a UFC fight, does he? I don't actually have anything to add about Val Woodburn because I didn't really do any tape on this fight, but I really struggle to think that Elliott deserves to be minus 250 in this fight. And even if so, I really don't think he deserves to be minus 300 for him to be actually any value. So I don't understand why you would even think about betting on a guy whose literal claim to fame is that he got the shit kicked out of him. Betting Elliott at minus 250 is a square thing to do. Don't put it in your parlays. It really is as simple as that. We move over to women's MMA next as Andrea Lee faces Miranda Maverick. I posted this breakdown in a written format in December of 2023 as the betting line was available then and I saw value on it, so I bet it early. If you've already read that, then you may want to skip over this bit, but I'm basically just going to regurgitate that word for word. The line has moved a fair bit since then, but you've had 2 months, so that's entirely on you. Anyway, without further ado, here is that breakdown. It's no secret that I've always been a pretty big believer in Miranda Maverick. I've had to recalibrate my expectations in recent years as she's had some very disappointing performances that I thought she should have done better in, like against Blanchfield and Jasudavicius. But I still rate her grappling very highly, and I think she's a nightmare matchup for any woman that's not got good scrambling and wrestling ability themselves. Andrea Lee is a bit of a weird one, really, not just for her choice in men and her potential Nazi affiliations, but because she's a decently well-rounded fighter with a decent well-rounded skill set and often ends up in competitive fights with whoever she's competing against. Despite all of that, the two things that are abundantly clear about her game are her poor takedown defense and her lack of power. When you're facing a wrestler who's pretty one-dimensional, those are the two key things that you need to have, the important skills that will help you get a victory, and she doesn't have either of them. The lack of takedown defense is obviously key here, and Lee's metrics are pretty shocking in that regard. To run through her UFC career figures of takedowns conceded versus takedowns faced: Macy Barber, 2 out of 2, Vivi Araújo, 3 out of 5, Cynthia Calvillo, 1 of 3, Roxanne Modafferi, 4 of 7, Lauren Murphy, 2 of 4, Joanne Wood, 2 of 4, Montala De La Rosa, 5 of 12, Ashley Evans-Smith, 2 of 10, and Veronica Hardy, 1 of 1. The thing that's glaringly obvious to me there is that Miranda Maverick's probably the better wrestler and grappler than anyone that I just mentioned, which immediately bodes well if women of lesser skill had success in landing takedowns. Pretty much every single name I just mentioned there had at least 50% in terms of their attempted versus landed success rate. Not only that, but when it comes to fighting on the feet, I don't think Miranda Maverick has the worst striking I've ever seen. She's actually outstruck every opponent at distance that she's faced in the UFC so far, which is a pretty impressive statistic considering we don't think of her as a striker. I also mentioned that lack of power, which I think is a key component to striker versus grappler fights in MMA when the focus is on damage. If you're not going to be in the realm that you want to be in for the majority of the fight, you have to make your moments count when you're striking. And Lee's lack of power is something that's going to really prevent her from doing that. Because Maverick is likely to have the better cardio here with her training at elevation, she should be able to rinse and repeat her wrestling and rack up good minutes in terms of round control time. What can Angela Lee do in the remaining time that's left to turn that round in her favour when she has pillow fests? I don't think there's enough that she can do. So clearly this is a fight where the gap in skill in the wrestling department is much more prominent than in the striking. That immediately warrants Miranda Maverick being a favourite in my opinion, but Lee's lack of finishing ability, her inferior cardio, and the fact that she's lost her last 6 fights that have gone the distance, I think that warrants Miranda Maverick being around minus 200 here, which coincidentally is exactly where the price tag is at the moment, but it wasn't when I bet it. If Roxanne Modafferi and Vivi Araujo can follow a wrestling blueprint and find a victory over Angela Lee, I think Miranda Maverick should have no problem at all. I was seeing Miranda Maverick at around minus 150 when I wrote this originally, which I thought was very far off the mark, so I put 3 units on her to win at that price, which obviously still stands today. Looking forward to hopefully cashing that one. Great CLV already, hopefully, unless there's a massive swing between now and fight day, which I highly doubt. I think Miranda Maverick probably wins a decision. She should be minus 200 here. I saw value. I had a 3-unit bet at minus 150. If you've been reading my Reddit posts for some time now, you'll know that I do not mind cutting corners and just completely passing on breaking down fights or doing tape on them. And on this occasion, the Ming Yang versus Ribeiro and the Quinlan versus Barlow fights definitely fit the caliber for that. When you consider that there is a UFC event for like the next 10 weeks in a row, burnout is a serious thing when you're trying to do full card breakdowns and a podcast like I am. So honestly, if I have the opportunity to skip on a fight and not do tape for one that I know I would never bet on, I'm going to take the opportunity. So sorry that I have nothing to say for these fights, but I haven't done any tape and it's better I don't bother rambling about it. So with that said, that is the end of the breakdowns. That is the end of the podcast. As always, just going to quickly review all of the bets that I plan on placing or have already placed for this event. I have 2 units on Volkanovski versus Topuria to go over 2.5 rounds at minus 160. 2 units on Anthony Hernandez to win at minus 163. 3 units on Miranda Maverick to win at minus 150. 1 unit on Garry to win by decision at plus 150 or better. I obviously haven't bet that yet. And finally, a 0.25 unit parlay pieces parlay, which is at plus 950, which is Garry, Merab Dvalishvili, Anthony Hernandez, Marcus Rogerio de Lima, and Miranda Maverick. I always say that I have a dog of the week, but honestly, I genuinely don't really like any of the underdogs this week, so I guess my vote is Paulo Costa, but I won't be betting him myself, so that's a very low confidence take. So there you have it. That is the UFC 298 card broken down in full with all of my bets. I will be back next week for the UFC Mexico card. I will catch you then.